So hello everybody, lovely to see you all. Well, lovely to see some of you, love to see little black boxes for the rest of you. So we have got two empirical reports that we're going to be talking about tonight. Wendy and I are going to be talking about careers advisors, career practitioners in higher education from the perspective of their one-to-one work. And then Siobhan and Nalini are going to be talking about a project that they've been doing, which has been looking at the changing role of career practitioners and their professional identity. They will tell you more about that later on. I'm sort of quite delighted that both of us have managed to bring it all together for tonight. It's almost as though we planned this as having such a brilliant theme to it. So we didn't, but it's lovely. It's lovely that it's all come together. So in terms of how we're going to handle it, Wendy and I are going to talk for the first sort of half an hour or so, and then there'll be 10 minutes for questions, thoughts, comments, heckling to us at that point. And then Siobhan and Nalini are going to talk for half an hour, 10 minutes for heckling with them. And then if the timing works out perfectly, that should leave around about 10 minutes at the end for us to sort of bring it all together, to have a look at sort of differences and similarities between the two projects. So do please chat away in the chat as we go. Please talk amongst yourselves and ask questions and make comments as we go, because that's always a really interesting part of it. And yeah, shall I crack on? I don't think there's anything else to say, is there? Right, let me just share my screen, and these slides, so it's being recorded and the slides will all be available on the NICEC website as well, but you can always get in touch with us if you want to know anything else. Right, there we go. Is that working all right? Can you see that okay? Right, so this is a project that Wendy and I have been working on for the last couple of years about career conversations in higher education. We're looking at student issues and practitioner challenges. So in the next half hour, we're going to talk a little bit about what we set out looking for, what we found, what we didn't find, and then we're going to end up thinking about what we're still wondering about. And it'd be fantastic to get some views from you at that stage about our thoughts and where we're at with that. So starting with what we were looking for, this was all about one-to-one career conversations in higher education. And it was sparked off really by my involvement in training career practitioners. So I work on initial training and I do lots of CPD and lots of writing. And it sort of occurred to me a few years ago that I would do this all much better if I had a really clear understanding of what the issues were that students and other clients brought to their one-to-one conversations. I thought if I really understood what their difficulties were, then I'd be in a much stronger position for developing curriculums that would actually help to equip career practitioners with the right kinds of skills. So that was the starting point for it. It's a mixed method study. We gathered some quantitative survey data on 600 career conversations in the UK. And then we did some in-depth qualitative interviews with 22 career practitioners. So the first thing we were looking at was quite straightforwardly the issues that career practitioners face in their one-to-one. So what do the students bring to their one-to-one career conversations? And we started off with a survey, and there was a theoretical basis for the survey. We drew on a couple of existing taxonomies of career difficulties. So the first one was one that looked at cognitive career difficulties. So this was Gatty and his friends, and they were identifying 3 clusters of difficulties: lack of readiness, lack of information, and then inconsistent information. And then Saka and her friends came along and said, okay, let's think about the emotional and personality related difficulties too, and identified some difficulties around pessimism, anxiety, and identity. So there were 6 sort of clusters of difficulties. And in the literature that came up with 22 separate items of particular career difficulties. So we took that to a focus group up at Newcastle University, and they had a look at their form to see whether or not it kind of made sense, and they added and changed a few bits and pieces. And then we got hold of a bunch of career practitioners up and down the country, so from Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the UK and England, and we got Russell Group, pre-92, post-92, so a whole bunch of different kinds of services. And what we asked people to do was for 1 week, for the period of 1 week, to fill out a survey for every single one-to-one conversation they had with a client. So quick queries and long interviews, not filtering everything, just giving us exactly what they got, because we thought that would give us quite a good overview of what was going on. This started in July 2019, and the plan was that it would go on for a full year, so we get the whole cycle But obviously in March, the pandemic reared its ugly head and everything became a little bit different. But by that point, we've got data on 600 different interviews, and we thought that was probably plenty. Also covered the most busiest time of the year, so we stopped at that point. So in the quantitative study, this is then what we found. So in terms of those 6 groups I talked about, the most frequent assessed ones were lack of information, anxiety, and lack of readiness. And you can see there was a whopping 85% of the students who came along had some kind of lack of information that they were presenting with. We also asked the career practitioners to say what they thought was going on. So they recorded, this is what the student brought, but also this is what we actually thought was going on. And broadly speaking, they kind of came up with the same things, but the career practitioners saw more. So it was a little bit, they saw a more complicated picture. So those were the 3 top groups, and then those were the particular issues that were most frequently assessed. So needing help with the application process, so that's CVs, interview skills, mostly CVs, but all those job hunting things. So more than half of those 600 interviews were about the application process. There was information about options, about researching options, anxiety about the uncertainty, not knowing how to make a choice, and then some anxiety about choosing. So those are the key messages from the quantitative study. We then wanted to follow up with some qualitative work, and so that was when we got hold of our 22 career practitioners, again, quite a range of people up and down the country, and just sort of unpick this in a little bit more depth. And what we ended up coming up with is a sort of conceptual model of what those career practitioners observe. So what do they see in the students that come to see them? And it sort of, the themes kind of worked quite neatly into these 3 areas. So there were behavioural issues that they saw, emotional issues, and cognitive issues. And we noticed that it was very sort of bi-directional. So it wasn't just that cognitive and emotional issues lead to behavioural problems. It was everything kind of influenced everything else. And another thing that we noted very clearly in the quantitative study, which also came up in qualitative interviews, was how complex these issues are. So on average, the career practitioners were saying that each student that came to see them had 4 or 5 separate difficulties that they were sort of addressing. So I thought that's quite interesting, and also just shows how hard the work is. On average, the interviews were 28 minutes long. So having to sort of deal with 4 or 5 separate issues, you know, which all influence each other and come from way back, was really quite complicated work, I think, for the career practitioners. So this is our model, behavioural, emotional, and cognitive. So in terms of the behavioural issues, what we were seeing the career practitioners talking about was that students tended to come quite late in their time at university. So sometimes, you know, right after graduation. There was a very amusing quote from one of the practitioners who was kind of, in a very affectionate and respectful way, slightly teasing the students and saying that they come along saying, I've got my bags packed and my dad's in the car and the engine's running. Can we just sort this out really quickly? And that was the sort of message that the students would give them. They talked about an inappropriate focus of activity, which mostly meant students who came along just wanting their CV checked. But underneath that, the career practitioners could see that there was a whole raft of other issues going on. But also under inappropriate focus, there was stuff about people being quite hung up on graduate careers. I want a graduate job, not necessarily knowing what that meant. And then they saw students who were perhaps unwilling or didn't realise that making career choices took that amount of time, and perhaps were a bit unwilling to take ownership, much preferring it if the careers advisor could tell them what to do. So that's the behavioural stuff. There was lots of emotional stuff. More than half the interviews in the survey had some kind of emotional issues going on. Lots of anxiety, all different sorts of anxiety. And the practitioners were saying that this does feel, those who've been working for quite a while were saying it definitely feels like there's more anxiety than there used to be. In partly because people are reporting it more, perhaps they always had it to some degree and people just didn't used to say, and now they do. But in partly they actually felt there genuinely was more of it around. Lacking a sense of agency, which kind of links with that idea of taking ownership, that students didn't necessarily feel that they could make choices, and lacking confidence. And then the cognitive issues were things around self-awareness, not just knowing about themselves, but knowing about a sort of work-related version of themselves. Lots about lack of information about labour markets, so how to get a job, but also stuff like what is work and what do people do at work? What are the different industries around? People talked about the lack of knowledge about the process of career development and also the career service offer, so that students often just didn't know what a career guidance interview was, what they would be doing, what kind of help they could get. So that's our model of the students' career issues, which we've kind of summed up there with don't feel I can, don't take ownership, and don't know how to, which you can see is quite a major problem for them to deal with. In terms of the consequences, we thought about this in terms of, some of you will have come across this, the Prochaska and DiClementi's trans-theoretical model of change. So this is a model of intentional behaviour change, and these are 5 steps that people might have to go through in order to actually, change something that's going on with them. And it starts with pre-contemplation, at which point people aren't really ready to think about change. They kind of might be vaguely, distantly aware that there might be a change ahead, but they're not really ready to engage with it. And then there's contemplation, where they begin to think, okay, I can see that I might have to make a move, I might have to make some changes, but I'm still not quite ready. And then there's preparation, where in career terms, people start really thinking about researching and working out what they want to do. And what our practitioners really were saying is that the students they saw tended to be quite high up that list, so stuck perhaps in the pre-contemplation and contemplation areas. And that was just a massive challenge to sort out in 28 minutes. They also talked about the fact that students would miss out on opportunities to access support and development, because if they were starting this process right at the end of their time at university, they weren't able to take advantage of everything the university could offer. Negative impact on well-being and confidence, because whilst in the back of their mind they knew that this was coming, it made them more and more anxious as the time wore on. And then finally, less fulfilling entry to work. It could well be that people ended up sort of making what the literature would call suboptimal career choices, and perhaps going into jobs that perhaps didn't suit them or wasn't quite what they wanted. We asked the careers advisors to talk about why this was all happening, what did they think was behind all these issues with their students. There was a lot of talk about social and practical pressures. It seems that the students these days really feel pressure from all sides, from inside themselves and from all around them. I've just got a couple of quotes there which might be of interest to you. So one of them was talking, one of the career practitioners was talking about students who feel this need to achieve the perfect life and the perfect graduate job. And there's another one, there are a few talking about high achieving students, perhaps from high achieving schools, who were perhaps, sort of guided into particular career choices, and then they get to a point where they think actually that's not right, and then they're kind of questioning themselves and saying, what's wrong with me? Why am I not enthusiastic about investment banking? They talked about limited life and work experience, the fact that young people don't have Saturday jobs in the way they used to, they don't necessarily do work experience at schools. They talk about the school culture, that young people today are used to being spoon-fed. There was a lot of talk about the lack or limited or patchy careers education in schools, and perhaps that lack of self-reflection. This was a nice quote here, that one of them said they've never been asked, so they've never thought about it. And then the complexity of the labour market, which is obviously makes everything, the competitive nature of it, which obviously makes everything more complicated. Oh, that was the last one. Then the HE messages. So within the university, there are mixed messages about what careers you should do, what the career service can offer, and how to go about supporting yourself. So that was what we found in terms of what's going on with the students. We then asked the career practitioners to talk to us a little bit about what they actually do in their one-to-one. So how do they approach, how do they respond and support these students? And the main thing they talked about in terms of the kind of value that a one-to-one can bring, or the aim of one-to-one, is about offering the students time and space to talk. And the practitioners supported that by doing a lot of work developing the relationships. There was a lot of talk about unconditional positive regard and all sorts of ways to make it a safe space for the students, non-judgmental, and also about managing the conversation. So there were slightly mixed views on how structured the conversation should be, but basically people started with a contract and they ended with some action planning. And then there was a sort of fluid bit in the middle. And the value of the time and space to talk was so that they could identify actions for the student, or the student could identify their own actions to help them manage their emotions and to enhance their understanding. So you'll see that that sort of three-pronged model fits quite neatly on the previous one I showed you about the students' career issues. So action-wise, they were really good at action planning. So they almost all said, you know, we leave the students with some things that they need to go away and do. And there was also a lot of talk about signposting. There tended to be very good relationships between the careers advisors and their colleagues around the university, which was really nice to see. Lots of brilliant work around managing emotions, lots of stuff about reassuring students, giving them permission, that came up a few times, breaking it down so it didn't seem quite so overwhelming, and then lots of stuff around boosting confidence. And then in terms of the cognitive stuff, there was stuff about enhancing that understanding of themselves, so lots of lovely questioning, challenging exercises to help them understand themselves a little bit better. And some really good stuff about aspects of the world of work. So job hunting seemed to be done really, the careers advisors seemed really, really confident about that. But there was a little bit more disagreement about sort of how important labour market information was for career practitioners, how important it was, how useful it was, and also what they should do with it once they had it. So that was something that was quite interesting to see. Right, I think I'll move on. Okay, let me just talk about a few elements of practice we didn't find that we were perhaps expecting to. So first of all, practitioners didn't really talk about how to generate options. So this was definitely something that they saw was a need in the students, but it just wasn't something that came up. One person once mentioned Prospects Planner, but in a slightly, you know, don't really use it that often, and I'm not sure it's that good way, but beyond that, very little on that. Very little on the whole process of career development and career decision-making, not very much on that. Very little on career management skills. So it was a lot about, one of them talked about recruitability, which I thought was a lovely word. So how to get jobs, but not necessarily the sort of longer term stuff. And for those of you who know that I'm a bit of a fan of career theories, I was a bit sad really to see that career theories didn't come up very much. So a couple of practitioners who were really, really into career theories and seemed to use them a lot, but broadly speaking, there wasn't very much on that. That was a quote from one of them, which I thought summed up most, who said, but the theory, so I think they are for me now, so far away, there's nothing really. I'm probably using it without realizing I'm using it. I don't really know anything, so yeah, that's just the theory that I fall back on. It's just my own made up theory. Practitioners seem to want to know about theories, but they didn't necessarily know what was up to date, and they didn't really know how to use it. So that's me. Wendy, are you there?
I'm there but muted. You should hear me now. Can you nod, Julia, if you can hear me?
Yes, perfect.
So I was in the land of the blind. This is Julia's turf, and I was a visitor, as it were, in this world. And I'm going to say a little bit about what career practitioners found challenging, and then a bit about some of the wider tensions that this study may highlight. So if we click on, sorry, I'm going to be like the medical officer now. What did the career practitioners say they found difficult? So there was a third strand in the survey that for the same issues, in addition to asking how the students presented and what the practitioners assessed, there was a third column for them to tick about which issues did they find most challenging to deal with. The practitioners identified at least one challenging issue in just under half of the 600 conversations. So there were quite a lot of conversations that they felt they could deal with reasonably well. And in general, I think the practitioners in this study are mostly quite confident about their ability in their job. It's not a study of miserable or angry advisors at all. But there were some issues that came up as challenging. So in terms of the survey, the commonest items were students with an unrealistic idea of how to make a career choice. And in the interviews, it appeared these are the people who want the practitioner to decide for them. They come to an interview expecting answers. And career practitioners find it difficult to deal with students who expect that when that isn't what the practitioner thinks their job is for. In the survey, again, a combination of lack of readiness, lack of information, quite a lot about anxiety, and low self-confidence also emerged in the survey as a challenge. So if we combine that with the interviews, we've got sort of three main headings, really. One is this idea of students who have unrealistic expectations of what that conversation will do for them. If you click again, please, Julia. These are the sorts of things that make the practitioners feel uncomfortable. I can't give them what they want. I don't have the answer. I'm not living up to their expectations. And coming on to the second bullet there, the second disappointment, which is not as complex but can be very profound, is students with a very unrealistic idea of the kind of opportunities they have. So if you look in the bottom bubble there, although you know it's the right news, it's still uncomfortable having to deliver that. And those were sometimes students who'd been oversold higher education, particularly higher education at prestigious institutions or on prestigious courses, who really thought doors would just swing open for them. Sometimes students from cultures where, if you've been to the right institution, doors do swing open, but unaware that that's not quite how the UK or European labour market may operate. The final point there then is also some students just with very complex needs, and those needs could be practical. So there might be an international student who's got visa problems, whose English isn't very good, who's got family pressures, a whole constellation of things. Sometimes those complex needs were also emotional, including pre-existing or borderline mental health issues, or very low confidence, where again, practitioners may feel they've got the skills to deal with those people, but very difficult to do it in a single conversation. So if you summarize all that, really CPs find it challenging when they feel they disappoint the students, or they can't help them enough within the service they're operating. So let's look at the next item. We asked in the interviews about professional training, both initial training and CPD. And the practitioners in this study were very keen learners, very motivated to go on learning. Three things they particularly often mentioned were they did want to get back to theory, particularly more up-to-date theories if maybe they studied a long time ago, but also the practical application of theory. They were really also keener on their initial training if it had combined theory and practice. Theory separated from practice they didn't feel was so helpful. They wanted to widen the range of what I've called here their helping techniques, especially coaching. Most have been trained in counselling, but were reaching out for other ways of helping people, not instead of counselling, but maybe alongside. Coaching was being talked about, but didn't mean the same to everyone or in different services. For some, working with that heightened anxiety and emotional set of issues, particularly managing their conversations well with people and being very confident about the boundaries with mental health services. We had some very good case examples of where advisors had worked very closely with their mental health colleagues. They also had strong views about how they want to learn. They would really like careers work in higher education to be a bit more like what they often called a proper profession. They feel very professional, but the structures in higher education are not quite the same as in professions that have stronger controls around CPD, professional supervision. They were very interested in short courses and in further personal study, and very interested in both peer learning and team learning. And those who were in services that had a culture and a habit of giving each other seminars, of discussing cases, of learning together, really appreciated that enormously. And again, it was interesting that obviously the interviews were done in lockdown. The early survey was a bit before that. And where they were in services that had a strong culture of peer learning and team learning, even though it was harder remotely, they had gone on talking to colleagues. Some of those in services that had weaker cultures around learning felt quite isolated, actually working from their own homes. We're going to end by looking at some tensions we noticed. Julia's given me this job to do because she thinks, as an outsider, I'm not going to get shafted by people quite as much as she would. We noticed some very interesting tensions. We have people who are very committed to a counselling approach, very student-centred, non-directive, trying to talk to students who just want the answer, whose father is revving up the car outside. The second tension is between students who lack information, but not simple information, the sort of complex tacit information about fields of work that you can't just get by looking up online. And we have practitioners with very varied views about both getting and giving information, especially now that so many practitioners focus some of their work, at least in particular faculties. There were some who were rejoicing in learning more about engineering or whatever it was, and some who really didn't feel that knowing stuff was their job, that their job is to be this non-directive counsellor. A third tension is between the sort of dream job, the dream career, the keeping aspirations, and the realities of the labour market, as we saw earlier, with trying to be realistic but not deflating people. Very difficult balance. And the final one on this slide is the unreadiness of students, which Julia described. Unreadiness not just in not having done much, but really having very little idea of career development as a process, coming into what at most was often a 40-minute conversation, many of them are shorter, and therefore advisors not able necessarily to take the students very far on that journey in that one conversation. And in some services it was possible to have multiple conversations, but by no means in all. In some of the services you were lucky if you got one conversation with the student. So a real tension between where the students are at and what you can do using that counselling approach in a conversation. So just to summarise before we take questions, let's just whiz through our sort of key points really. Career practitioners think that really quite a lot of students are struggling with their careers at the moment, and this isn't a COVID issue. These are advisors taking a long view, and they think it's got worse. And they think students have issues with ownership, that's the behavioural part. They don't feel they can, they are finding it difficult emotionally, and they don't know how to. They are really cognitively short of the skills they need to tackle this stuff. Practitioners do have a wide range of approaches at their disposal, particularly to steer the conversation, to use that space, to deal with emotions, to deal with self-awareness, and to look at planning. But there were some gaps. There was a funny gap about the practitioners not articulating career development as a process, including where one-to-one guidance fits within it, which is exactly what they're criticising the students for not having. Also, practitioners were oddly reluctant, I suppose, or didn't volunteer when asked about what they do, to reply to this issue about what you do with students who have no idea what to do. How do you generate some options? And I've already mentioned this ambivalence about not labour market information, but subtle labour market intelligence, with different practitioners feeling different about it and a lot feeling a bit ambivalent. The biggest challenges are around disappointing students, as we've mentioned, because the practitioners are incredibly committed to helping their students. They are positive about CPD and pretty clear what they want. And then Julia and I are left wondering. We're left wondering about some very deep tensions that this study sort of flushed out, really. between careers service models in the particular context of higher education, which includes the attitudes of academics. It's not just about the careers service. The actual issues of students, which we hope we've described, the very much counselling-based tradition that practitioners are working in, and their preference, to be honest, for one-to-one work, which they see as often, you know, the most important work they do, but then their experience of and commitment to helping engaging the actual students, where the model they're working in doesn't maybe take them as far as they would like to helping those students, and where, although they get the logic of careers work in faculties, they find engaging students in that work really quite difficult. I'm going to stop there. We said we'd end and have a few minutes for questions. So I think, Julia, back to you for questions.
Fabulous. Right, so we'd love to know what you think about it. I'll have a look at the chat in a second, but we'd love to know if there was anything there that struck a chord, is there anything that you recognise? We'd like it even more if there's stuff that you didn't recognise and you don't agree with. So just any thoughts, comments, questions, heckles, please feel free.
And the chat is full of wonderful stuff. I can only just see it. Yes. So if anyone wants to, we'll look at the chat carefully, but if anyone wants to voice an issue, do.
Oh, come on, I'm sure somebody does.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question, actually.
Yes, go on, daughter.
You hear me? Hi.
I hear it beautifully.
Yes, this is Dorte Petersen from Aarhus University in Denmark.
Well, how lovely to have you here.
Thank you so much. Maybe I missed it, but do the students agree with all these issues and the consequences of not thinking career early on? Like, are they realizing these consequences themselves? I think you went through that maybe
no, I think
really quickly. Were they asked about that, or were the career practitioners only asked?
Study, daughter. That's our next study, daughter. We haven't spoken to students about this, but it would be really, really interesting, and I think that'd be a great follow-up to see whether or not they recognise that in themselves. The two theoretical frameworks that we based the study on, from Gatti and Sacca, are both they were both evidence for self-report about students themselves. So it feels to me quite likely that the students would recognise it, but we haven't tested that.
No, okay.
To add something there, I think, although this is a study through the eyes of practitioners, so it is a particular perspective, that anxiety, the huge emergence in this study of this anxiety that students are presenting with, particularly anxiety about the uncertainty of the process they're engaged in. Will I find something I want to do? Will I then be able to do it? I think hints at what you're asking, that the students, that is how the students are manifesting their understanding of the situation they're in, if that makes sense. So the anxiety that the practitioners are seeing, if the students didn't think they were in trouble, they wouldn't be presenting as anxious, is what I say.
That's true. So that's a more indirect way of measuring it, I guess. Yeah.
But it would be lovely to hold the two up together. It
would. Okay.
Because of course
thanks.
We're also seeing it through the eyes of people who have their own preferences and their own take and their own professional identities, as Siobhan and Nalali are going to talk about in a minute.
Okay,
so,
thank you.
Some of it may be what the practitioners want to see, or, all of those issues. Absolutely.
Well,
so I can
thank
see
you.
John and Michelle, you both have your hands up. John, I think you were first. What were you thinking?
Just a couple of things. As I mentioned in the chat, this is really, great research. I think it's got real implications for our training and development, and it's a really strong empirically based study, which is really good. Sorry, can I ask a really horrible, awkward quant question? What quant?
I've got Wendy here.
All right. What quant analysis, just out of interest, did you use for the quantitative study?
Very limited at the moment. Counting, we're going to do a lot more.
So it's mainly Yeah, so it's mainly descriptive stats in terms of the percentage
Descriptive
of...
stats, and sometimes the ratios between things. We have looked at the relationship between the things that the practitioners assess, for example, and the things that students present with. That's quite interesting. And the things, so we've compared, we're working with 3 columns really: seeing, assessing, and finding challenging. So we have looked at that.
We also had a little look at different demographics. So we found out information about gender and about stage of study and fee status, and we had a look at those. Oh, and different type of university as well. Didn't find any particular differences, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting seeing how much hasn't changed since I first practiced back in 1992. But I think one of the key ones, which I think we really zoomed in on, is the impact of the pre-tertiary experience and the performativity regimes that we all exist under. So it was great stuff. When are you going to publish it, by the way?
Yeah, when we get to it. Michelle, I've got Michelle and I've also got Stephen. So Michelle, let's have you first.
Yeah, if you can hear me. I just wondered in your analysis whether you'd taken any account of the work of James Marcia when he looked at career decision making, where people had just followed what was expected of them and then later came to realise that although they'd done everything right, they weren't actually happy with what they were doing.
I haven't come across him before. Can you pop his name in the chat, Michelle? I don't know if you have, Wendy.
No, what we did see though, Michelle, is there is a rich lot of material in the interviews about advantaged and disadvantaged students and different kinds of institutions. And crudely, very advantaged students may suffer more from always having been golden children and doing what they're told and then thinking, I haven't even thought about what I want to do with my life. And no one's ever asked me that. But there are also less advantaged students who may have, in a funny way, more self-awareness, but then face greater barriers in other ways. So very complex picture of people, their sort of prior experience of decision making and of agency. Really, agency is a big issue, I think, that emerges.
I think perhaps with the people from lower working classes, it's perhaps aspirations versus expectations, and therefore expectations take a stronger influence. Perhaps those with more advantaged backgrounds, it's a case of never having had to reflect on what they were going to do, and they often get to 28, early 30s and think, how did I get here?
I think we saw some of that, and we also saw impossibly high expectations on some students from others in their lives. So it's expectation of self, but also in relation to others.
Stephen, can we just hear from you? And then I think we'll leave the floor for Siobhan and Nalini. What were you going to say, Stephen?
Okay, I was going to say, well, there's all sorts of things to say. And one thing that strikes me is this seems very familiar. This describes exactly what it was like when I graduated 50 years ago. And it seems to me it reflects the experience of my 2 sons graduating 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether it has changed very much. My second point, though, is we spent a lot of time in the 1990s in the Enterprise in Higher Education programme working on all these issues, working with careers workers, looking at material to prepare students for the interview. If you've only got 40 minutes, the more they can do in advance.
Yeah, quite.
We have examples of that. Also, a lot of useful work done on group work of various kinds, which can be in some circumstances clearly more economical. And then finally a point about working with faculties and academics, engaging academics, particularly in those disciplines where often there is a very close link between most students' career routes and the subject, the engineers and the electronics people and so on, where often the academics know more about what work is actually like in the industry than the careers advisor ever can. Does that ring any bells?
One of the, I think, most troubling things to come out of this, and it'll be so interesting in a second when we hear from the other half of the evening, as it were, is that all that makes the work that these same practitioners are doing in faculties around careers education completely rational. but they found that much harder even to engage students in than get them to come for a one-to-one conversation. And that's, I suppose, one of the troubling dilemmas this study has left me wondering about. That actually students are very resistant to engaging in that work because they're so busy doing everything else, and their studies are also challenging and difficult.
On that bombshell, let's hand over to Siobhan and Nalini to hear a little bit about their study.
Thank you, Julia. I think Nalini is going to be our Chris Whitty and move our slides on. So
No, I thought you were.
oh, I thought you were doing it.
Great, excellent. Off to a
We
flyer.
failed on the
We
first
failed on
activity.
the first person. Do you want me to share?
Can you? Yes, because on my Mac it tends to go a bit funny if it's not
Right.
there already. Are you able?
Okay, I haven't got the
Apologies.
final version that you sent through to me. That's the only thing, but we can make sure that's the version that's circulated afterwards. Does that sound all right?
Yes. Yeah.
Excellent. Good. Well, now that we've instilled confidence in our
Indeed,
audience, I feel that we're
indeed.
really ready to go.
Thank you, Nalini.
Okay.
Okay, excellent. We, as you will have worked out by now, we're going to do a bit of a two-hander. And the research we're going to present, I think, is fascinating, really. And I'm so glad that we've presented them in this order, because I think what we're going to be talking about sort of complements quite significantly the work that Wendy and Julia have done, but also brings us to a slightly different perspective as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Our study was funded by HEXU, and it very much focuses on trying to understand the journey that careers professionals have gone on over the last sort of 10 years or so, a sort of taking stock of where things are at the moment. And what the perceived thoughts might be for going forward. So Nalini, if you can take me to the next slide, thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about the background and the context to the research, very briefly about methodology, the literature, the findings, and finally some recommendations in terms of exploring how AGCAS in particular might be able to work with and use the research that we've conducted. So moving on to the next slide, the project itself, as I said, we're aimed at sort of examining how the role of the 21st century HE careers professional has evolved, and this came from a number of different ideas, really. I think both myself and Nalini have talked over a number of sort of times about the various perceived drivers, enablers, and challenges that practitioners are continually experiencing. And I think the work that Wendy and Julia presented conceptualises that incredibly well. We wanted to look at those within the HE careers service context who were perceived themselves as careers professionals, delivering careers education, information, advice and guidance. And this built on work that we both previously done around identity of careers professionals, and John Goff has also done work in that area. But I think what we were quite interested in exploring was really this window that looks at sort of the transaction, if you like, of how higher education has changed with the introduction of the 9,000 plus fee structure, and what the implications of that may or may not have been on higher education career services, and particularly the various metrics that have been imposed on universities. So moving on to the next slide, we undertook a qualitative study using a constructivist lens. And John, before you ask us about the quants, it is purely descriptive. And similar to the previous study, we captured data from Russell Group, pre-92, post-92, and specialist HE. the methodology that we adopted was a literature review. And one of the things that we were really interested in exploring in more detail, and Alani is going to talk about this shortly, is around Celia Whitchurch's work on third space professionals and how that sort of influences our thinking in terms of how the roles of careers professionals are evolving and developing within the HE context. So the sort of three-part element of sort of data capture was we started off with a focus group. We had planned to do 3, but we started this at the end of January 2020. And for those of you who live in the East Midlands, the day we did the focus group was the day that Clifton Bridge virtually collapsed and Nottingham had the greatest congestion in the world over the next few days. Unfortunately, the other 2 focus groups we wanted to do, we weren't able to do because, you know, COVID took over and the world went into mad panic. But we did have a really fruitful and rich discussion with 11 participants who joined us from representing 3 universities in the East Midlands. We did invite all of the East Midlands universities to contribute, and a number from 3 took us up on the offer. We then did a survey, and again, this is very much about the timeline. So we're very conscious that we had 84 responses. We had hoped for a significant number more, but obviously this was all taking place bang in the middle of the pandemic. So the limitations on that quants data and those descriptive statistics really just gives us a snapshot. But in addition, we undertook 10 interviews, and these were individuals that responded to the survey, volunteered to help us further. We developed a purposive sample to reflect the various types of institution that we were interested in. So moving on to the next slide, I'll hand over to Nalini, who will take us through some of the literature.
Thank you, Siobhan. Thank you also for reminding me that there was a point last year where we thought the single most disruptive thing for our research was going to be the closure of the Clifton Bridge. Which clearly then 4 weeks later turned out not to be the case. We were also giving one of the PhD students at Nottingham an opportunity to work with us so they could develop their research experience and their Croatian. So they had to flee the country before the borders closed partway through our literature review. So I think it's fair to say we've all grown as people, but hopefully what we've been able to do is pull together something which is still of value and relevance, very relevant given our current environment. So this was the context in which we were conducting our work. On the basis that we were thinking about 10 years back, we wanted to have a look at the environment in which our participants would have been operating. And so actually the 2007-2009 recession was relevant because, as people that work in this space are very familiar with, there's always a lag with graduate recruitment in terms of the impact of a recession, potentially in terms of when the jobs dry up, but also when they come back again. The dot-com recession in the early 2000s, a lot of graduate recruiters cut their pipelines quite harshly and then regretted it in the mid-2000s when things picked up. So what we've tended to see since then is a little bit more of a lag. It takes a little while for jobs to vanish and then a little while for jobs to come back. So actually, the recovery from the banking crash in 2008 didn't start to really take place till 2012, 2013. And of course, that was a very lively time in English universities and in Wales, because that was the point at which undergraduate tuition fees went up to circa £9,000 from £3,000, which made quite an impact on how universities were viewed by potential students. We also saw a significant increase in international students during that time, as well as an increase in graduates overall. And of course, midway through the last 10 years, people started, can you believe this, the future of work and how it was going to change by 2020, which of course was not wrong and happened on quite a different timeline for reasons people may not have been able to anticipate. But there was a lot of talk about the skills for the future of work, which was also starting to feed into the kind of career conversations that some people were having. And I've put ongoing volatility in the labour market because it always is. But as I say, we had the recovery from the banking crash, then we had people starting to speculate from the mid to late 2010s about a referendum result, which actually did start to have some impacts. So the operating environment for these practitioners for the time we were reflecting on, we felt was significant. The other thing that happened during this period, which is not unrelated, was the ascendancy of metrics and the impact then that that could potentially have on practice, because the Brown Review in 2010 that suggested the raising in fees meant that the narrative around university as having to deliver value for money became much more prevalent, and that value for money was regularly conceptualized as getting a good graduate job, and therefore a mark of a university offering a value education was that they would help their students to find that graduate job. But of course, the idea of measurability in our space is not new. And there was work that we could build on in terms of how do you measure and quantify the work and impact of careers professionals, and people have conceptualized it in terms of the input, numbers of users, sessions per users, process in terms of the actual process of career support that our clients experience, and also output, and also some discussion around what constitutes productivity, because you can measure time, but actually if that time doesn't result in outputs, is that actually productivity? And where does client satisfaction, where do behavioural and learning outcomes, economic and social outcomes fit into that sort of approach? And then of course in the university sector we have been blessed by a lot of people who want to measure and rank us, particularly over the last 10 years. So the destination of leavers for higher education, which is not new. In fact, when it stopped being the metric that we used to see where graduates went, we had 50 years of previous Delhi surveys that had taken place, but its prominence in its last 7 years was extraordinary in terms of how institutions looked at it and how people putting together league tables measured it. The National Student Survey has a facet of satisfaction which can be linked to career support. Longitudinal educational outcome data, which we could do a whole seminar on from its name onwards, was also linked to perceived career success when it was actually linked to salary. And then of course graduate outcomes, the successor to Delhi. So all of these metrics for the careers profession within higher education exerted quite an influence, because they were linked to the idea of did somebody get a job? Did somebody get a job was linked to value for money. And in the 2010s, a university delivering for value for money in England and Wales, and I would say therefore more so across the entire nation, came to the fore. So that was the context in which we were looking at what we found. And then as Siobhan said, we were very interested in the Whitchurch conceptualisation of professionals in higher education institutions. So Celia Whitchurch in 2008 recognised that there were a growing number of roles and services that weren't research and teaching and weren't the operations and facilities that kept an organisation going, but were in this space of professional services that were student facing. And she recognised that there was an increasing broad-based approach to certain agendas that were bringing people in from all areas to work together, which meant that there was an increased need to balance creativity and innovation in professional practice in universities with formal institutional obligations. And in 2013, she produced a very interesting report which suggested 4 categories of what she called third space professionals, who were either bounded in their space, that was what they did, cross-boundary in their space, but happy to work with other people in a bounded space, unbounded, who were happy to work across a number of spaces but recognised that there were boundaries, and then blended professionals who she suggested saw themselves as working seamlessly across a number of services, which should themselves see themselves as relatively seamless in the context of institutional agendas. So that was the literature framework in which we did our study. And I'm now going to hand back to Siobhan to tell you something about our findings.
Thanks, Nalini, for that. I think it's really helpful in terms of the context that we were interested in. So we can move to the demographic data that we got from our survey respondents. as I said, we do recognise that the response rate was quite low, so this is indicative, shall we say. But a lot of the practitioners that we engaged with had been working in the sector over that period of time. So well over half of them had been working for sort of 5 to 10 years or so, and we got a good split between pre-92 Russell Group or post-92s. And you know, one of the points we often come back to is around sort of the gender breakdown of career professionals, and true to type, over 77% were female respondents to the survey. One of the things that we were interested in was looking at the type of qualifications that practitioners were either bringing to their profession or were actually engaging in as part of the ongoing professional development. So linking in with some of the points made earlier, the majority had done a professional qualification linked to careers, either the DIPCG or one of the other qualifications around career guidance. Those that hadn't had, often had psychology qualifications or HR qualifications that sort of supported the type of work. Something that we were really interested in, though, was how many practitioners had started engaging in fellowship of the Higher Education Academy. And as you can see from those numbers, sort of 20% of those that responded were fellows. Quite a small number were senior fellows, but again, 11% had got a teaching qualification already, often a PGCE. And one of the things, we haven't mentioned it here, but we did come across a number of people who were doing doctorates or had done doctorates. And I think that's a real area of interest that we'd like to pursue in more detail, and understand more about what the perceived benefits were for those who were doing higher qualifications. So move on to the next slide, just break it up with a little bit of a chart, or rather a pie chart here. So as you can see that the participants' length of time spent in higher education, one participant was actually working there for over 30 years, but the majority had been in the sector for quite some time, although the largest number had been there within the last 5 to 10 years. And also looking at the number of people currently working in participant services. One of the things we did talk to about them in the survey, and we'll share this in a few moments, was around resourcing. So it was really interesting to understand sort of the size of the surveys that size of the services, sorry, that practitioners were coming in. So, we got 4 surveys that had over 100 staff. So, and a number of those are quite large services that contributed to this piece of work. So if we move on to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about how the careers professionals defined and described their roles. And again, this reflects very much what we've seen in the earlier presentation. The focus was very much about supporting students, that student focus on career development planning, including navigating recruitment processes. So it's really interesting to understand that, that's what practitioners are aiming to do, but actually students aren't necessarily prepared to be able to engage in that. The predominant types of work are what we would expect, so one-to-one. That was considered very resource intensive, but was valued. And we did get some slightly differing views around guidance. I'll come on to those shortly. But also around workshop activity and the differentiation between what was perceived as bolt-on careers activities and those that were more aligned and embedded within careers education type programs within the curriculum. And also, I think one of those evolutions was around the student-facing role being seen as more academic consultancy and partnership with academics and senior stakeholders. And again, we had one respondent who talked about the importance that what we're seeing as, well, actually it wasn't, it was more than one, talking about the strategic and project-focused activities within their role, and those practitioners differentiated sort of the core activity, which was guidance, but then more strategic type activities or particular projects, which took up a much larger amount of their time, as often being more valued by the institution because they were often more quantifiable. So real focus on employability, and as we've already identified and also came up in the previous study, there was a growing number of practitioners who were located in faculties or non-career service locations, and their role was increasingly being focused around support for the teaching excellence framework and other external metrics. But also that their role was evolving much more around engagement in teaching and learning, and less so around the one-to-one. So that one-to-one and one-to-many was evolving quite a lot over the study. And then moving on to the next one, we talked to them about the types of expertise that they've brought. So I think it would be really good for us to get together with Wendy and Julia and to compare these. So LMI was one of the real strengths and their connections with the world of work. So some of the points I think Stephen mentioned earlier around sort of academics' knowledge of those particular areas is quite interesting to explore in more detail. That coaching and guidance and the individual support skills was very much those strengths that enable them to facilitate development and one-to-one, and professional skills around planning, negotiation, student focus, Rogerian, totally central to the work that people were involved with. And again, there was some sense from perhaps some of the newer practitioners who hadn't trained before they came into higher education, that they perceived that people who've been in the profession for some time, that the counselling model of guidance was what those more established practitioners really valued. But perhaps there was a little bit more tentative questioning around that with some more recent entrants to the profession. The curriculum development and teaching was one of the areas that was particularly growing. Ethics still there, and Julie, you'll be pleased to see that some did talk to us about their understanding of career theory, and planned happenstance, as is often the case, is one that people feel very connected to. So very quickly moving on. The ability to help students develop their skills and that consultative role with academics was really important. So as I've already said, those involved with HE for a longer periods of time recognised that the role had evolved from one-to-one focus into much more strategic. Nalini, can you take me to the next slide if possible? Thank you. But also that response to academic departments was really important. Supporting placements, employability. I think we've moved on a slide again. No, we're going back. Next one. Next one. Thank you. That's it. Yeah. No. Can you take me back to the one before?
I don't know if there is one before.
There should be. I'm
really sorry about this.
That's all
How about
right.
that? Is that any good?
That's the one.
Perfect.
That's the one we want. Thank you. Sorry, Nalini, I'm confused.
No, it's quite all right.
Yeah.
I think it's important we don't intimidate our audience by being
So, okay, back to what I'm talking about. So the role in working with academic departments had become much more central, and also the different roles. So there was much more of within some instances, a reaction with that the work that practitioners were doing was much more directed by the discipline areas they were working with. And as I've already said, some people, some practitioners were resistant to that growth and that breadth, and felt much more comfortable in the one-to-one sort of counselling approach to work. It was seen as important, as I said earlier, but strategic work was often seen as more impactful, and this is newer, perhaps more recent entrants to the profession, being schooled perhaps more in the importance of impact and measurement of practice. And I thought this quote was really quite interesting. In the practitioner said, nothing we are recognised for comes from guidance, yet it's the core part of the role. I think we could unpick that and possibly do a PhD on it. Variety of views on one-to-ones, as I said, some feel they were doing less, others felt they were doing more, but again, reflecting what the previous presentation, there was a real feeling that students had much more complex needs, and that was particularly challenging for practitioners. Also, the emphasis and the focus on employability, 62% felt they were doing more on employability, and they were working more with academics. So moving on to the next slide, there's a broad continuum with practitioners feeling that the work that they were doing around employability was represented well by managers. We were interested to understand how they felt the career service itself was perceived, and who was fighting their corner, if you like, who had the voice to promote the career service and ensure that it was central to the debates, discussions and the strategic approaches to employability. And some services felt that the career service had very little voice, and the decisions about what was their specialist area, employability, that they weren't always engaged in, they weren't included in that. So there was raised concerns about the lack of value in career services by the institutions. And that there was a feeling that where services were faculty located, that they had a greater opportunity to influence, and that the value that they offered was more perceived. So the metrics were perceived very much as influencing and driving the employability policies, and as we said, they were some of them seeing their role very much around supporting TEF within the faculties. But the visibility of career service and how they were perceived within the institution did influence their potential power and the influence that they had on employability. The sense was generally that this needed to be addressed holistically, rather than being sort of separated between academics and career professionals. And some of the examples we were given were departments where you had a multiple of people involved in employability activities, not necessarily always coordinated and with different levels of expertise. So moving on, I'm conscious of time. As I said, we were keen to understand what the resourcing looked like and whether practitioners felt that there was more resource or whether there was few resource. And interesting, it absolutely split down the middle. 38% felt that they were doing more with fewer resources, 39% that they had felt that their resource had increased, and the rest felt it was pretty much the same, that there wasn't a huge change. But the knowledge and expertise that the practitioners brought with them, that they did see themselves as specialists and really wanted that recognition and value of what they were bringing as specialists to this whole area. Again, an interesting point, a common title for many of the practitioners was consultant, and this was felt to be more appropriate and complementary to their academic focused role. One practitioner was really very resistant to the idea of being called an advisor. They felt that was very reductionist and it didn't reflect the role that they were actually involved with. So the alignment with curriculum, we've sort of started conceptualizing as sort of a para-academic review role. And this sort of linked very much with that support for both the metrics and the academics within the discipline areas. Those practitioners often felt that the integrated practice where they were delivering within the curriculum had much greater credibility than dropping in and doing a workshop, so to speak. But also discipline area was important. And we talked about the personality of the practitioner, and that was very much about how dynamic the individual was to get involved and to be seen to be involved and to promote themselves as a professional and an expert within their area. And the relationships with academics and academic managers were incredibly important. And as I've mentioned, concern about multi-professional teams. So final slide from me, and then it's over to Nalini. The sorts of issues that were identified, and again these reflect what we've already spoken about, was how the role had changed, was increased numbers of international students, and this resulted in practitioners feeling they needed a greater level of knowledge about international labour markets and cultural needs of the students they were working with, and some institutions were developing programmes specifically for this market. Whether they will still be needed, who knows, as the international student market, I think, is very much under consideration with post-COVID. But technology was again one of the major issues that came out, and the pandemic had pushed this to the forefront very, very rapidly. So practitioners felt they needed to be digitally literate and using creative technology. And in some of the instances we were presented with, they had got so involved with the local faculty, they were developing loads of different materials and resources, and their expertise in that was hugely valued. The type of digital technology that is being used reflects, I think, guidance across the rest of the country. Teams and Zoom, assessment centres were being presented online, webinars, etc. And again, this all demonstrated just how dynamic and versatile the services were in moving very, very rapidly to new modes of delivery. But again, this was an area that many felt they needed more staff development on, and this catapulted them into a new direction of travel. So Nalini is going to take us on to talk about how roles might evolve over the next 5 years.
Thank you. So I am the nice balance to Wendy, who is a complete outsider to this world. I'm a complete insider, and I recognise that. And it's very interesting conducting research in the sphere in which you are immersed. So it was very interesting to see how respondents envisaged the future in the next 5 years. I mean, I think to some extent, I would look at that and say to some extent there's more of the same based on the trends that have been emerging over the last few years. So more of a focus on disadvantaged students, and we know that the Office for Students have introduced access and participation plans to help institutions to hold themselves to account in terms of the social mobility piece, international students, and greater focus on alumni, which of course the Graduate Outcomes Survey introduction has also accelerated. More focus on data, expectation to demonstrate impact, and then of course the online revolution, which I think, to be fair to a lot of the services, was always underway, but in a much slower and steadier way. And I think I remember in the original focus group, some people, this is February 2020, what about virtual services? Well, do students really want virtual services? Do we really need them? I don't think so. So clearly people's thinking has evolved with our times. But when we look then at their sense of professional identity and what would help them to be a community of practice, it was really interesting the things that seemed to matter to them. This sense of being a community of practice that was active, and this picks up on some of the comments that Wendy and Julia covered about access to CPD and the importance of efficacy in practice, because most people are driven by wanting to make a difference and do the right thing. So they want to know they're doing the right things in the right way. There was a sense that careers was not as valued as it could be. The role in an institution that seems to be able to endorse the most credibility and give the strongest sense of value is definitely academic. More so, I would say, than the senior leader in an organisation. Academic endorsement is really, really valued and prized. There were colleagues talking about the issue of resourcing, and alongside that, better positioning within institutions so that there was more influence in terms of their roles, which would help them to feel more as if they were being professionally recognised. But in a way, this sort of vindicated our study, I suppose, because if people had said, no, I don't think my identity's changed at all. But actually, as you can see, well over half either strongly agreed or agreed that their identity has changed as the space has evolved in all the ways that we've been outlining to you. And I think here's some context which led to that proportion of answers, which I think is quite interesting. There are people recognising the increased awareness and focus on graduate employability. Checking CVs is always the way that people seem to conceptualise how their role is or isn't understood, and they didn't disappoint. So people felt they were respected more than for just checking CVs. The university had broadened beyond just checking CVs. There is something here about the almost guidance versus academic engagement and curricular involvement, which I think is emerging as something of a narrative amongst careers professionals in terms of what good looks like, feels like, and should look like. I think those two are being juxtaposed in quite an interesting way when people explore that. There is some response perhaps to our pragmatic reality when we're engaged in university metrics, so an observation on completing spreadsheets, and then a perennial here that there is still amongst some this notion that careers guidance and coaching can be done by anybody and you don't really need that much training. So we did also ask about what may happen post-COVID. It was a little bit of a bolt-on question in that when we did the survey, it was April. And I think if we're all honest, we thought we'd be back to normal by July. And then when we were conducting our interviews virtually in August, I think it was reasonable to think that COVID was going to be more of a thing than we might have hoped. So we did ask our interviewees what they felt were going to be the potential impacts of COVID. And I have to say our respondents were really quite balanced given the disruption that this has had. So there were a lot of people that could see opportunities in terms of a hybrid delivery model, and they were particularly excited about accessibility and the fact that more students could engage with services more easily, perhaps in a more level way than might have been the case. They were also excited about developments of their professional practice. I got the sense that a lot of people had surprised themselves by how much they've been able to do in response to the pandemic. And so there was actually quite a lot of positivity around something that might previously have made them quite nervous. So this idea that you could be developing digital content that could be shared, that could be put into online learning packages, there was a lot of excitement around that. The accessibility to graduate recruiters and how that potentially leveled the playing field from a social mobility point of view also excited people a lot. And there was quite a lot of appeal around working flexibly and from home, and this recognition that you didn't have to be in a room with someone necessarily to conduct an effective one-to-one interaction. But reality bites, and so people are always very aware of the potential resourcing implications of being embracing of something that's more virtual, more hybrid, that perhaps means that there's less need for staff. So in terms of our sort of conclusions and the conclusions that we drew, I think we got a sense that there was a professional identity. I think to some extent it's a professional identity that's in transit. I think to some extent it's a professional identity that is slightly dispersed because it represents the diversity of the services across HE that are by no means uniform, even though there are structural trends. But certainly some of the common threads we pulled out was the importance of articulating the expert input so that a contribution to a metric is an added value and not the primary driver for the work that we do. The parity of esteem with academic colleagues would make a big difference to a sense of professional identity, and HEA recognition and higher degrees were ways in which that could be achieved. This idea of visibility of career services across all disciplines. So I think across some of our respondents, and it worked both ways. Sometimes they felt superfluous because the area was so vocational. Other times they were really embraced because the area was so vocational. And then likewise with non-vocational areas, some people really wanted the career service because there was no obvious career path. And then in other areas, because there was no obvious career path, what was the point of getting the career service in, because there weren't specific careers that this subject led to. So as ever, it depended, but certainly this sense that visibility was important. This idea that the positioning of a service strategically was so important, and the more people that felt that was important would be helpful. And then also a sense of vigilance, so that as employability became more important, which perhaps meant there were more opportunities for careers professionals to work across the institution, that decentralisation didn't turn into dilution or a sense of competition. And wrapped around this idea that there should be more succession planning within career services, so that there was more management capability and confidence to follow some of these through. And then there are some implications for AGCAS, and I can say this with impunity because I am the AGCAS quality director. So there was an element here of holding myself to account that I'm very comfortable with. But there is no question that I think for a strong profession, a professional association has a really important part to play in supporting its members with some of the challenges that we've outlined here. And some examples that we identified were around training and development, particularly based on this study around digital delivery, but also strategic leadership, positioning and in political influencing. Career theory. So Julie has mentioned the fact that she's a big fan. I was really interested in the number of colleagues who said, it's really important to me that we are seen as being, you know, on a par with academics, or that we are embraced in terms of giving curricular input. But the theoretical underpinning for that curricular input, or the lack of it, made me quite nervous, actually, when you think about how academics are driven by research-informed teaching. So I think as a professional association, we have a responsibility to help people to really think about that. But also, I think we have to help careers professionals to foster and develop their identity as roles across the sector change so much. As some are central, some are decentralised, some are faculty-based, some are less so. I think some sort of framework to bring it all together is going to be really important, so they can continue to articulate their expertise in whichever setting they are in, so that we still keep this sense of a careers profession. So those were our key findings and recommendations. I'm going to stop sharing and hope that you found that useful and a helpful complement to Wendy and Julia's presentation. And I think we're open to questions and comments, I think.
That was so interesting. There's so much in there, isn't there? And there's a lot that kind of tallied with what we found, but also a lot that's kind of quite different. So that was really, really interesting. Right, about 5 minutes left. Then there's been lots of chatter going on in the chat, which is always nice to see. But any people got some comments that they'd like to make or questions to ask?
Could I pick on someone, Julia?
have
we
yeah, go ahead.
Have we still got Lucy with us? Lucy said something very interesting early on about the idea of a counselling type model in the context of a one-to-one interview, whether it was damaging to persist with counselling when you couldn't really deliver counselling in the time. But I'd like to hear what Lucy meant, because I was fascinated by her comment.
Can you hear me, Wendy?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm very wedded to it, because I've been doing the career coaching course MSc at Birkbeck, but I was involved in a kind of student career coaching program where we were able to provide at least 6 sessions and have a supervisor, which was really richly resourced. I worry about career professionals that I work with in FE colleges and schools as well, who are having career conversations, but it's they can only have one. And then very often, particularly in with younger students, there are issues that are coming up about safeguarding and anxiety. So then the career practitioner is then you know, using the safeguarding rules that they have. So then actually the student in different ages is experiencing a very quick, sometimes often very enticing conversation that could be the first one they've ever had, and then that's it.
We worried about the same, Lucy. I think it struck me because there does seem to be an odd tension between the ethos of counselling and this sort of one conversation model, although in some career services we studied it was very possible for students to come back and rebook, but in many it wasn't, and in none did we find a planned series of conversations where there was an assessment and then booking 6 sessions, which if you had a mental health problem you'd get, but if your career is really ill you don't get. So I think it's such an interesting question when counselling was the dominant method amongst our practitioners. That's what, so your question was so interesting.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can I just add there that having had years of involvement in training career practitioners, something that's been consistently emphasised is they have counselling skills, but they are not counsellors, and therefore in the contracting at the beginning of one-to-one interventions, they need to be clear about their boundaries and manage those expectations of that intervention and its outcomes.
Yeah, I really agree with you, Michelle, but it's really difficult if you've just got one conversation and you're doing the boundaries and the contracting and then and if you've only got a very short time, I just think it's really challenging for people, for practitioners and for students.
I fully agree with you. It is challenging, but just to emphasise, they are developing counselling skills, but they are not seen as counsellors.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
John, you've also got your hand up.
Yeah, just to echo what Michelle was saying, really, similar to her and similar to quite a few of you, having trained, educated and assessed a huge range of practitioners. The trouble with a counselling approach per se is you can take the items out of the box, but you can't always get them back in the time you've got. And I just wonder if this is where the goal-directed ones and coaching can be very interesting. One very brief question, and I know it's a huge one. I sometimes wonder when people are talking about data analysis and data-driven services, what that actually means. That was something which was raised. And I know learner analytics are very important in HE now, but I just wonder what data-driven services might actually look like.
So I think they're on a journey, which is the ultimate opt-out answer. But I think the external metrics have forced services to be looking at how employment outcomes are reported, although we know that an employment outcome reported is not an indicator of employability or career satisfaction. So I think the impetus in the last few years has been to try and develop internal metrics that can address more of those issues. So I noticed in the chat David Winter talking about careers registration, which is an obvious and increasingly popular way by which a lot of institutions track progression across a continuum of career thinking. But I think also the advent of quite sophisticated career management systems for services to be able to, you know, track appointments, engagement, that sort of thing, so they can look at student trends and generally not be run by anecdote in terms of what they put on, when they put on, and what it involves. I think that's the way in which people generally understand data driven, and then it varies to a greater or lesser degree depending on the sophistication of the data analytical capability within a service or an institution.
I love that phrase, don't be driven by anecdote, Nalini. That's a very nice one, isn't it? Listen, I'm going to have to bring it to a close. It's just gone 6:30, and I don't want to keep you all from your gin and tonics or your Zumba classes or whatever you've got planned. So thanks very much to everybody. Thanks for coming along. Thanks for engaging. The slides, the recording will all be on NICEC. We might be able to put the chat on the NICEC website as well, because there's loads of great things in there which I haven't quite worked my way through. So thank you very much, and good night, everyone. We'll see you again soon.